Greetings, everyone. Thanks for joining. Today, as a church, if you're a part of HIF, it's our last day of the 40-day prayer and fasting. I hope you've been able to work through this each day. Today's point is church vision, and what an important time for us to be coming together before our great shepherd, saying, Lord, lead us, show us, be our guide in these times, unite us around your vision. Now, don't throw the prayer guide away, because often we wonder, man, what should I be praying for today? Well, you can just be flipping through this, keep it on your desk or wherever you have your devotional time, and just flip through different prayer points each day. Well, in Holy Week, Jesus' last days on earth, we've come to Thursday. It would have been April 2nd, AD 33. In church history, this has been called Maundy Thursday. We'll see it's a little bit longer today. The last evening before Jesus' passion narrative, the crucifixion. Now, Maundy in Latin, it comes from the word commandment. As we'll see, this is the beginning of John's long teaching, chapter 13 to 17. Now, we could spend hours on the content of this day, but we're just going to try to survey to understand how the events fit together. Let's begin at scene 1, the Passover preparation. You can go ahead, hit the pause button, and read Mark 14, 12 to 17, and then rejoin me in a moment. The celebration of the Passover meal goes back to Exodus 12. The blood of lambs would be applied to every Israelite home in Egypt, offering the protection from the outpouring of God's judgment upon the Egyptians. Now, by the time of Jesus, it's been roughly 1,500 years where this permanent sacred rhythm has been put in the Jewish annual calendar. And because of God knows the people are spiritually forgetful, each year this is how they would remember God's deliverance, by celebrating Passover. Now, the disciples did not know what arrangements Jesus had made, so they asked him. Remember, Jesus' rising celebrity status among the crowds and also the plot against him. Well, Jesus gave the preparations for the Passover with a great degree of secrecy. Now think about this scenario for a moment. The population swelled in Jerusalem from roughly 50,000 people to now roughly 200,000 people. And so it makes this scenario very unlikely to go find a man carrying a jar of water. It's kind of like finding a needle in a haystack, or me saying, hey, go find the flower seller in Hanoi that's wearing an orange shirt. You're thinking, yeah, right, Jason, how am I going to do that? Notice how these events in Jesus' last week, he gave his disciples this improbable and impossible task, and the events unfolded just as the Lord said would happen. This just reaffirms his authority of his words and the actions that he was demonstrating, such as in Palm Sunday, entering Jerusalem on a donkey, just like the prophet Zechariah said would happen roughly 500 years earlier. In his final days, Jesus shows his authority in his words and actions. Now let's move on. Scene 2, we come to the Passover meal. Let's turn to Luke now, because he gives us more details than Matthew and Mark. Go ahead, hit the pause button, read Luke 22, 14 to 30, and then rejoin me again. And I recommend circle and highlight what stands out as you read. Now, throughout the history of the Jews, practices of Passover continue to evolve, we could say. Eventually, there was more customs that were added to the meal. You can go look at the rabbinic teaching to see this. But for a Jew, it became a highly ritualized meal that's called the Seder. That comes from the Hebrew word order. Now, today, Jews that celebrate the Passover with the Seder meal, it looks like this. You have a roasted lamb, bitter herbs, unleavened bread, fruit sauce, 4 cups of wine, from the statements from Exodus chapter 6. Now, just the images that come to mind of the Last Supper for us, we think of Leonardo da Vinci's fresco painted in the 1490s, remembering Jesus and his disciples in a setting like this. Now, in fact, a more accurate vision of that night would be a table like this, with the padded cushions, reclining on the elbow, feet pointed outward. This is the setting that would have been more accurate. Now, the setting of the upper room, likely that would have been the owner of a house, a person from great means and wealth, because 2-level homes were not very common. Now, this This is the traditional site of the upper room if you go there today. Since the 4th century AD, this is what it's looked like. Today, this is considered one of the holiest locations in Jerusalem. It's also believed to be the location the disciples met after the Lord ascended to heaven, Acts chapter 1. Now, this night, this location is where Jesus instituted what we call communion, the Lord's Supper, or the Eucharist, which comes from the Greek word which means to give thanks. Now, as you read, what did you notice about Jesus' feelings at the meal? His longing to be with his disciples enjoying this final Passover. We forget his last moments where he was enjoying fellowship in this intimate emotional setting. It says he fervently desired. In other words, it's like saying, I have desired with desire. And he explains the broken bread, this is my body which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me. In a few moments, in a few hours, his body would be broken by blows and scourging and the crucifixion. Also, what stood out for you? For me, it's that word covenant that stands out. The new covenant established in my blood. You see, the old covenant established by God with his people at Sinai, it was inaugurated with blood. The blood of sacrifices. It goes back to Exodus 24. But now the new covenant would bring the forgiveness of sins for all people, inaugurated by blood shed on a Roman cross. What else stood out for you as you read? Did you notice the words, for you? Very personal. Twice. The cup and the bread, for you. Now, of course, we were not in that room 2,000 years ago, but by extension today of being his disciples, Jesus was speaking to us. So for a believer, a follower today, when Jesus went to the cross, he had you in mind. He gave himself to open up the way for the coming of God's Spirit so we could live and receive forgiveness from sin and also being a part of his new covenant community. Now, all of a sudden, at this intimate scene, there's a startling announcement. Did you notice what it was? He'll be betrayed. Luke 22:21. But look, the hand of the one betraying me is at the table with me. And did you notice what the disciples did? This is crazy. Instantly, they try to identify the betrayer by questioning each other. And they're clueless. They're thinking, who could it be? Now, only Luke tells us what the disciples did next, and this is really shocking. They started to argue about who's the greatest. And only Luke gives this conversation at the scene. Now, you see, they all had this preoccupation with power and achievement and success by fighting to be number one. Just like the world, they were hungry for authority. As you read this, can you believe it? The disciples, they wanted to know, who God would put at the top of the best disciple of the year list. Now, Jesus then does what's unbelievable and shocking. He puts an end to their discussion with a powerful illustration. He contrasts the leadership of the world with leadership from his kingdom. And this begins the next scene 3, and only John gives us this. Go ahead and begin scene 3, hit the pause button, read John 13, 1-20. Again, circle what stands out, and then join me again. There in the first century, all over the Mediterranean world, people wouldn't wear, boots and tennis shoes like we do today, but they would wear leather sandals and they would always be covered in, dirt and mud and everything else as they traveled the countryside and the roads throughout, Palestine and Israel. And so the custom of the day was then at a meal, you would lay on your side at the table and you'd eat with one hand reclining, and the host would offer a servant during the meal. It would never be the host, but only the lowest of servants who would wash the guests' feet. You see, as the host, this is how you'd show your extravagant hospitality, and you'd be able to show your ability to welcome and embrace the guest. And what has Jesus done, church? He's revolutionized the social structures. He's flipped them all around. Now he is the host, displaying his hospitality and how he will treat people in the kingdom of God. It reminds me of what he did back in John chapter 2, there when he was invited as a guest to that wedding at Cana. Remember what happened? He then took the role of host and provided the best wine, the wine of the messianic banquet, the best for last. Now, I love how artists over the centuries and all over the world have tried to capture this very famous scene, Jesus washing the feet of his disciples. He also not only takes the role as host, but also as servant. And the Lord here lets the disciples encounter him in a completely unexpected and unprecedented way. Now, I've said this before, in John's gospel, he doesn't give us parables like Matthew, Mark, and Luke. I believe instead John gives us a living parable. It's like the Lord himself is living out this upside down kingdom, and he displays it right here, the way of servanthood. Remember, what were they just doing? They were fighting about who's going to get the position of power. And then Jesus here says, having loved his own who were in the world, he now showed them the full extent of his love, modeling what would be seen on the cross, this self-sacrificial love. And then he invites them to participate. For I have given you an example that you also should do just as I have done for you. He would soon say, I give you a new command, love one another just as I have loved you. You must also love one another. By this, all people will know that you are my disciples if you have love for one another. Now, what John goes on to say next, only we find it here in the Gospel of John. It would have been maybe an hour or so of teaching. It's called the Farewell Discourse or Address, midway through chapter 13 all the way to 17. Now after Easter, it's so rich and packed full of great teaching. We're going to look at this after Easter, roughly 6 weeks, the last set of instructions Jesus gives to his new covenant community. But there's also some final twist in the drama here late into Thursday night at this intimate scene. Jesus calls out his betrayer. John says that Satan entered Judas. Judas departs, and then Jesus also goes on to predict Peter's denial. This now sets us up for the final scene here, the late into Thursday night at the meal. Departing the upper room, they sung a hymn. Likely it would have been Psalm 118 maybe. Departing, walking over 2 kilometers to the Mount of Olives, as you can see here on the map. And here, Jesus shakes things up again with a prediction that they will also all fall away from him that very night. Matthew tells us, tonight all of you will run away because of me, for it is written, I will strike the shepherd and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. Peter famously contradicts Jesus' prediction, claiming that he would never fall away and will follow Jesus to prison and to death. Well, the end of the scene happens late into Thursday night, Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. But our time has come to an end for this short devotional. Take time today and meditate on what happened from Matthew's account, chapter 26, verse 36 to 46. Jesus begins to share his anguish with his closest human friends as he was filled with great sorrow and distress in anticipation of his final hour. He prays, a model for his disciples and for future believers, as he feels the weight of the full submission of the will of God, yet his disciples are found sleeping. And as I leave you in the Garden of Gethsemane, consider the question, as a Christian, what does the cross mean for you? His sacrifice on the cross, what does it mean here in 2020? As you ponder this, like yesterday, I leave you with some from our church community who would like to share their answer with us. See you tomorrow as we prepare for Good Friday.
Everything. It means everything to me. But maybe the first thought I had to answer that question is freedom. I think the cross means freedom to me, that I don't have to live this life the way everyone else in the world has to. I don't have to go after things like money or status. But I can actually go after the things that are really important in life, which is to love God and to love others. So, yeah, that was the first thought I had about what the cross means to me.
I remember as a teenager learning about the real meaning of the cross and being struck by the fact that that was supposed to be my punishment and my shame and my separation from God. It's not even fair that Jesus took it for me, but he did. And I'm eternally grateful, and that's changed my life.
The cross is a place of refuge where I get my strength, my care, and my protection of Jesus Christ. The cross represents the finished work of Christ and a sacrificial love that gives me grace and his forgiveness and his mercy for free without relying on my own good works. The cross is where I run to whenever I'm weak. The cross makes me strong.
Cross for me means everything. And as I was thinking about this, for me, it's not so much the cross itself, but what Jesus did on the cross. So I could sing, "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found. Was blind, but now I see."
As a Christian, the cross means that God's acceptance of me into his family is not based on my own performance, but it's based on Jesus and what he has done for me. Because of the cross, my sins are forgiven, and I'm accepted by God, and I can then worship and love and obey and serve him, not out of a duty or striving to earn anything, to be accepted, or to achieve anything, but I can do those things while resting and finding joy in the reality that is finished. My sins are forgiven, and I'm accepted by God.
To me, the cross is the perfect sacrifice of love of the Father. It means that my sins are forgiven, that I have victory in Christ Jesus every day. And that's what the cross means to me.
To me, the cross is the most important thing about the Christian faith. There are so many reasons that I can cite, but I want to highlight two. The first one is the love and grace of God upon my life, because without the cross, there was no way I could be reconciled with God as a sinner. Number two, the cross is the very foundation of the entire Christian faith.
So the cross of Jesus Christ gives me identity as a Christian, because it is through the cross that we receive the salvation of Jesus Christ. And this identity of being a Christian is the one that gives me family and friends wherever I am, because we can connect on the same belief, we can connect in the same faith, and we can connect in the same principles. If I encounter any challenge, I have hope in the cross. And this is what gives me peace.
I grew up in a very strict, old country, Roman Catholic family. The cross was always a part of our lives. But now, as a born-again believer, the cross means two things to me. First, a choice to obey God, to follow his will, and not to follow the desires of my flesh. And second, salvation. There's a Latin phrase, in cruce salus, in the cross is salvation. Shalom.
Is how the cross symbolizes the greatest sacrifice made by Jesus. Because through his sacrifice and crucifixion, Jesus has brought salvation and atonement for anyone who believes in the blood of Jesus. And as Jesus told his disciples to deny themselves and carry their cross in Matthew 16, I think the cross serves as a reminder for me to fully submit myself to Jesus in absolute surrender and self-denial so I can walk worthy in him and follow him as a Christian.